Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Voldu toku ingoa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Voldu, my pronouns are he, him, and welcome to the Aotearoa's Engineering Response to Climate Change. To open us up, I would really like to share karakia timatanga. Tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho, kai tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katua, haumi e, hui e, tā hiki e. A bit of an agenda for today. So just share the opening with everybody, and I'm going to soon introduce our panelists, which we're all very excited to meet. I'm going to hand over to Richard to share a bit of the climate action work that Te Ao Rangahau Engineering New Zealand has been doing, and he's going to share a bit about that. Opening up to the panel discussion, we're going to share the panelists a couple of exciting questions. And as Jordan just mentioned, there's going to be a session at the end that's going to focus on your questions that you can submit throughout the panel event. I'll remind you, so don't worry, and then we're going to close. Over to our panelists, the very moment that you all have been waiting for. This is so exciting to have all these really impressive panelists on our panel today. Starting off with Nicole Rosie. Nicole Rosie has had a 20-year executive career at board, CE, and senior executive level across the public and private sector. Joining Waka New Zealand Transport Agency as Chief Executive in February 2020, she brought with her more than 2 decades of CE and senior executive experience across the public and private sector, including leadership roles at Toll New Zealand, Kiwi Rail, Vector, Fonterra, and 3 years as CE of WorkSafe. She's a passion for roles that links care for people with economic outcomes, having deep experience in transformative change, system thinking, high-risk regulated industries, and health, safety, and environment. We've got Richard Templer. Richard has been the Chief Executive for Te Ao Rangahau Engineering New Zealand since November 2020. A senior executive for 20 years, he worked for government, local government, and meat and wool industry. Prior to that, he researched meat automation at Industry Research and medical products at Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. Richard grew up on a farm in the Waikato and has traveled with work and study. He's married and has a 1-year-old son. We've got Evangelos Pastras. Evangelos is a chartered civil engineer from Greece, currently working as a project manager in the UK energy storage industry. Since moving on from conventional civil engineering, he has been involved in the delivery of more than 300 megawatts of lithium-ion battery storage facilities in the UK. He is here as a member of the World Federation of Engineering Youth Engineering Organizations Young Engineering's Future Leader Working Group on Climate Action, with which he participated at COP26. He's also a member of the steering committee for the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition Youth Advisory Group. And we end our panel group with Tracey Ryan. Tracey Ryan is the Managing Director in New Zealand for engineering, design, and advisory company Aurecon, and is responsible for the leadership and performance of approximately 850 people across 5 locations. Her career to date has been focused on business growth, leading enterprises with multidisciplinary teams, and creating inclusive and engaged cultures. She held senior leadership roles and directorships in several global professional service companies and has a strong New Zealand, Australian, and global network gained from professional service experience throughout New Zealand, Western and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Pacific Rim, China, and the US. Tracey is the Deputy Chair for Infrastructure New Zealand and Chair of the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, or FIDIC, Sustainable Development Committee. Tracey's technical STEM background and 25 years international professional service experience makes her incredibly passionate about getting more young women and girls to STEM careers. Now that we know all our panelists in a bit more detail, I'm going to hand over to Richard to share a bit more about Engineering New Zealand's work on climate change. Over to you.
Thanks, Waldo. I'll just share my screen now. Kia ora, everyone. And I'm Richard Templer, as mentioned, and it's my pleasure to talk to you about engineering climate action, our response to climate change. So I'm going to provide an overview of what engineering climate change is and our particular response, talk about the available resources and our resources and development, and then rather than discussion, go to the panel conversation. So in any challenge or problem, there's a why, a what, and a how. So why are we doing engineering climate change? Well, the climate is changing. The fact that it is changing is all around us. If we look at recently in Wellington, we've had the wettest winter on record. Europe has experienced the highest temperatures, and Victoria has recently had unprecedented rainfall. These are impacts driven by a climate change cycle, which has clearly been impacted by human activities, anthropogenic climate change, and we need to do something about that now. The what, this is not really up for debate. The Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act was passed in 2019, and I note it was passed 119 to 0. So it was a unanimous decision of Parliament, and its targets are to reduce net emissions of all greenhouse gases except biogenic methane to 0 by 2050. So it's pretty clear cut. And to reduce emissions of biogenic methane by 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050. So it's a very clear target. It's been jointly agreed in Parliament, and I note that both our leading political parties have confirmed that they are not going to be shifting from these goals. So that makes the why and the what very straightforward. In terms of how do engineers do that? That's the focus of our program for Te Ao Rangahau Engineering New Zealand, Engineering Climate Action. So the key to that is engineers taking a leadership role. Engineers are problem solvers. We like challenging and difficult problems, and this is what we're faced. So in order to lead, we have to work out what are the problems that need to be solved and how might we find those solutions. So we have to understand the issues, work in partnership with Māori, work in partnership with a whole range of other professionals and other parts of our societies so that we can deliver solutions that work. And our objective of this program is that engineers, stakeholders, and the wider industry are supported to take informed, positive action to respond to climate change. And I note the emphasis there that it's informed, but also that it's positive. So for us, our influence is about changing hearts and minds. It's improving engineering practice. It's advocacy through direct advocacy to government, but also to the profession and providing short leadership. It's leading by example, so it's reducing our own carbon footprint, and it's setting clear standards of professionalism. On our website, you can find a whole lot of resources in the Engineering Climate Action page. So that's just on the off our main Engineering New Zealand website. And what we currently have is a clear position statement on climate change, an introduction to the climate change in the engineering world. We're providing practice guidance for engineers. So this is the how to do stuff. And this is what we see as really important. So we're providing engineers with the how to solve problems, information for businesses wanting to manage their carbon footprint. And we've provided this because we've been through that exercise ourselves and determined how to work out our carbon footprint and what to do about it, and then discipline-specific resources, including specific tools. What we're currently developing is a engineering climate action steering group. So there's a call gone out today by our email to all our members. We're working on case studies, including a case study on our own carbon reduction plan. Practice notes, so this will be in more areas of practice that you can reduce carbon. We'll be developing professional development courses, continued professional development courses on how to engineer in a lower carbon world. Providing resources for client conversations, because we recognise those are some of the difficult conversations to have. And also these webinars and other webinars on climate conversation, including bringing in people from other disciplines such as architecture and science in this space. So thank you very much. Now on with the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing that. And it's really exciting to see that Engineering New Zealand stepping up and trying to provide the industry with that resources and the material and the guidance. And it's really nice to see that working with Evangelos at the WFEO, this is something that they really try to do. And they're not seeing that proactiveness across the world. But we'll get into that discussion very soon. I'm really excited to share our questions. So just as a reminder, these are some set questions to the panelists up front, but please submit your questions through the question bar at the bottom, which we will get to at the end. I'm going to start off our conversation today. So when we try to create questions for these sessions, one of the things that really popped out is a lot of the climate action work that happens across industries, across the world actually, there's a lot happening in the policy and high level decision-making space. So Tracey, I'm going to throw this one to you. How does consultancies fit in the climate change picture, and not just the narrative of making your own company carbon neutral?
Yeah, thank you, Walter, and kia ora, everybody. And look, Richard, I think you touched very well there on the why, the what, and the how, right? And you certainly touched on the why. And kind of if we step back and think about the challenge around decarbonisation of economies around the world by 2050, but also, the United Nations have named this our decade of action towards achieving sustainable solutions, to achieve some of the world's largest complex challenges. That I suppose the need of action has never been greater. And Walter, to your point of the question around where do consultancies fit in, there's one part of our own sort of footprint with regards to that, but that's just a small component, right? The reality of what we lean into and what we do day to day, working with our clients, working with our extended sort of ecosystem around those sort of worlds. Scientists and engineers and all play a huge part of that in relation to being able to address very complex and deal with the challenges kind of that. And in reality, we know that we're kind of reaching a net zero emissions, whereas it's going to require a huge transformation with regards to that, whether it's creation of new assets that we're looking at, whether the transition of legacy assets and working towards that. And, I think our understanding of very complex processes and systems and our ability to develop out-of-the-box solutions and thinking has never been in greater demand. So, that's the role that we kind of play and how we work alongside, the likes of Waka, Kotahi, and Nicole, her team. But it's more broader than that. Is also how do we lean into research and development? How do we lean into innovation? How do we bring all of that to light? And then how do we collaborate and share a lot of those sort of knowledge and experiences and things like that across the ecosystem is going to be really, really important collectively to come together in that sort of way.
It's a really good holistic way of looking at it, knowing that we all have that bigger role to play. Yeah. Any other one want to contribute to that?
I might add to that as well, because we touched on it, part of my role is the role I play with FIDIC, and I have just come back of being there a couple of weeks ago in September. And I think the question got raised that, I've been doing profession, you kind of, when you read my synopsis, right, I started my career in 1995 in the world of professional services, and in some way, environmental and looking things was seen to be a really nice thing, that add-on thing. And we kind of gone beyond that now of something that just sits on the side and kind of ticking boxes and things like that. And the comment which was getting made there was that, we've moved beyond just this awareness, this sort of tick box, and ultimately that it is a need, a call of action. It's certainly, it is a call of actions. There's an urgent sort of critical need. The days of talking about this are sort of gone, and the reality is we have a moral obligation to do what we do as well in relation to that.
So true, and that word action, and I think that leads well into my next question around sustainability focus on projects and bringing that action component into it. So Nicole, with your role working with a lot of projects of Waka Kotahi, will this level of project intervention be sufficient to reach the IPCC goals or the government goals, or do we need more of a radical sustainability approach?
Well, the answer is no and yes. So, so no to the will work at project level be sufficient? No, it won't. And yes, too, we do need a more radical approach. And really, the answer to the question is really about looking at the targets and saying, how on earth would you ever achieve that? So in New Zealand, transport, the space we're in, is 18 to 19% of the emissions profile of the country, but will be responsible for 50% of the emissions reduction in New Zealand under our current plan to achieve Kyoto in 2050 carbon neutrality. And the targets that have been set for us to achieve that by 2035, so the shorter term targets, are a 20% reduction in vehicle kilometres travelled in New Zealand. That's not carbon kilometres, that's all kilometres. 30 to 40% increase in, or decrease, but whichever way you look at it, the use of electric or non-hydrocarbon vehicles in the fleet. So 30% of our fleet moving to electric or non-hydrocarbon in the light vehicle fleet. 30% of our heavy fleet having fuel that is not emitting. And there's also targets around accelerating the heavy vehicle fleet, including buses, to electrification. Those are really ambitious targets. And clearly, you can do all you like at individual project level, removing embodied carbon, but you're not going to achieve those levels of outcomes and the projects in themselves are not going to achieve those goals for New Zealand. So these are not transport targets, they're in fact urban shaping, urban forming and community targets, and they're really around saying we need to start thinking about how we design our cities, our communities and the infrastructure that supports them quite differently. And also at some level think about how we use our existing infrastructure better and actually try to avoid, to the extent we can, building new infrastructure because there is, in our space at least, new infrastructure, particularly roads, means more vehicle use, which is one of the areas we're looking to reduce emissions from. So it is a fundamental shift in the way we think about the role of transport in New Zealand, and therefore a fundamental shift in what the transport sector is likely to be investing in doing and the way that we will be behaving. And what we're seeing is the start of that. And of course, in a New Zealand that is wanting climate outcomes, but not quite ready for it yet, at a personal level, very challenging because we've been given these targets, very short timeframes. We don't have our urban shaping really lined up to deliver more compact cities. We don't have transport networks that allow people to live, play and work all off non-carbon emitting transport forms. We're well behind Europe, Australia, the rest of the world in all of those areas, walking and cycling, light rail, mass transit, even heavy rail. And so the challenge for New Zealand, whilst you've gone to a project level, and of course we need to reduce emissions in anything we do and everything we do, it should be part, you can't be zero unless you're doing that everywhere. But the challenge for New Zealand is the scale of change is even bigger for us because we have picked transport, the other being, of course, in our case, the ag sector, which is actually very hard to reduce emissions in. Transport's also extremely hard. But we can't just decarbonise our electricity sector or stop, digging stuff out of the ground. The things we've got to do as a nation are actually quite significant and will require us to think and act quite differently. So it's very challenging and it will require substantial change. But I would add, I think we're well ahead a lot of the world, and certainly Australia, in our transport sector and how we're thinking about that and how we're thinking about not only urban shaping, but the use of digital tools, the use of incentives, disincentives, behavioural change. The type of thing you're seeing in Road to Zero is the type of thing we will need to do on scale. And you're also seeing the challenge of doing it and just how hard it is for the people at the front line. And just look what's happening with Auckland Transport at the moment as they've tried to make a transition to both safety and climate in the Auckland region. People want it, but they actually don't want the interventions that across the world actually have been evidence-based, proven to give people options, choice, and to reduce travel movement, which is what we're aiming for through these goals. So a long way of answering the question, but there's a lot involved, and it is a huge pivot, and it is obviously occupying an enormous amount of our attention, effort, and probably tripling our workload, in that you're now not only delivering projects, but you're working with New Zealand to try and bring communities along who are all in completely different places, and actually trying to line people up on targets that they can't even see how they could possibly contribute to, or in their mindset, it's just not possible. So we've got some very big challenges, and we actually need the sector, the engineering sector and many other sectors, to step in and lead to support that level of ambition and change if we're going to get there.
That's a really good answer, really inclusive of the bigger picture that needs to change. And I think that there's pockets across New Zealand that's doing really well, achieving what you're saying, all those changes that's required. I mean, look at Christchurch and the way they're doing things over there with the cycleways, and that the whole environment over there is really what we're trying to achieve across other places. But inherently, the community was set up differently from the start to be able to do that. So retrofitting is difficult, but we are getting there slowly but surely. Yeah, and I think that leads so well to a question that I want to ask Evangelos. And gaining from that international experience, just from the UK, what's across the borders that we can use in New Zealand? What have you seen that's really good examples or outcomes that we can use across our sectors?
Thanks, Waldo. And before I jump straight into the answer, I want to thank you and Jordan and Engineering New Zealand for arranging this, and obviously inviting me to this fantastic panel. I think I just want to add on to what Nicole just said. It's a very complex project we're trying to put here in terms of our transition. It's not, there's not a singular correct solution or way through. There's the upgrading of our existing infrastructure that we all know is critical, but there's also this cultural shift that needs to take place, and you know, our personal transition to a sustainability mindset that needs to happen, and quite quickly. So this might end up being a bit more disruptive for people than what we might be expecting. So just to answer to your question, I think there's several international policies, umbrella policies around our transition to a net zero reality, but I think their impact and their successful implementation will continue to depend on their adoption, but also their actual implementation at a national and a local level. This seems to be the challenge a lot of the time, at least in the stage that we are at now. So I think I'll try to keep this at a high level, but obviously we can discuss in more detail in a little bit. How I see it is there are two sides towards accelerating the industrial shift to sustainability through legislation. The first one is the enforcement of such legislation and the penalization of bad practice. This is a necessity in order to ensure that major contributors, emission-wise, are held accountable for their impact, and this will also assist a more just transition through the reallocation of potential capital and resources from streams created, such as carbon taxation, just as an example. The second side, the second approach we could follow is the incentivization and reward of good practice and innovation. We all know there's a significant step up in technology that we need to do, so we need to assist this and enable this through the incentivization and reward schemes of legislation. Personally, I feel this is a much better driver for change, reward rather than punishment, let's say. Like I said earlier, while on the one hand we need to abandon a lot of our business as usual practices, we also simultaneously need to shift to a sustainability-based outlook towards business and industry, right? So we have to keep in mind that the private sector, which drives and leads a lot of these problems, also revolves around profit and growth. So how I see it is that incentives such as tax credits, subsidies, and the availability of those to enterprises of all sizes, not just the big players in each industry, are the ones that enable the faster deployment of green assets that we need, and will consequently drive our shift toward net zero. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I just want to highlight one last point around legislation. From COP26 and having conversation with policymakers, people in the legal space, I have come to the conclusion that policy around transparency is also key, and this is across industries. It applies to energy, to transport, to intergovernmental relationship. I think transparency and visibility is critical. This may reflect on the calculation and the reporting of national contributions, for instance, but also the operation and the performance of businesses in each industry. I think having better visibility around KPIs, key performance indicators for stakeholders, allows the optimization of processes, the minimization of losses, potentially could increase the creation of synergies across industries, which will enable a faster transition. And then lastly, but not least, definitely the better communication and thus the wider adoption of best practice and innovation, which we all know as engineers is a key piece to the transition puzzle. So I think I'll leave it at that, Waldo, but happy to elaborate more. Thanks for the question.
Really well said, and I think there's a lot to unpack in that response. There's a lot of good things that we can take on. One thing that pops to mind, and this might be out of the just out of nowhere, but Nicole, in terms of that incentive, how's Waka Kotahi being experiencing the incentive for e-vehicles or electric vehicles?
Yeah, so I mean, in reality, a lot of what we've done in New Zealand to date has been in the incentive category, and we've been a bit slower on the stick, if you like, that was just talked about. But we've got a, and I think there might even be a question about this. We're doing a lot in the incentive category. So the EV discount, we've seen a dramatic increase in EV vehicle uptake. With 50% of people indicating they are looking at purchasing vehicles now, indicating in New Zealand that they will look to purchase an electric or hybrid vehicle, which is, we're still very low percentage of our total fleet that is decarbonised, but we're certainly leapfrogging from the bottom of the developed world to sort of much further up the ranks. And it looks like if we continue with that, we could substantially move up the ranks in terms of decarbonising. But for New Zealand, that is not a panacea. The average age of our fleet is 12 to 14 years old. We've got the oldest fleet, one of the oldest fleets in the developed world, and we still have very big equity issues, which mean it's going to be very difficult for low-income New Zealanders to access some of this technology. So one of the second areas of investment, or incentive might be another way to put it, is the 600 million the government has allocated towards a social leasing and scrap scheme that was announced last year. We're leading the implementation of that with a pilot likely to occur. It will be announced by the end of this year, early next year. On a couple of pilots are already underway actually in South Auckland around that, and that's about getting people that can't afford these vehicles into vehicles over time. The third thing I would say in there, there's a question that touches on this. It's probably not known, but we actually invest across all activity classes. So Waka Kotahi is investing across public transport, walking and cycling. In fact, we're delivering a lot of walking and cycling. We're actually delivering a lot of public transport. We're certainly working with councils on all of that. We are also investing in coastal shipping now. We are deciding who gets the investment funding for that. We are doing the long-term planning and integrated networks for mass transit, and we are also the people deciding on the public transport subsidies, including advising the government on that. So yes, we are also involved in the public transport discounts that the government has. In fact, we do all the work behind all of those announcements that are being made always at last minute about RUC discounts and everything else. So yeah, we are behind all of that. And the interesting thing about the question of do you subsidise public transport, we'd actually be recommending you are far better at this time to be supporting additional bus drivers into our fleet. We have a real shortage of bus drivers. Pay of bus drivers is a real issue in New Zealand, and it's a pretty jolly hard job. And additional capital support and to a support investment of additional vehicles into the fleet, because actually the biggest issue in this whole climate adjustment for us is if it's not if it doesn't match the car for convenience and accessibility, people don't use it. So, and everywhere in the world that's seen a step change in public transport use, it is not climate that has driven that behaviour change. It is that the options that are available are as efficient and effective. Pricing can stop the other options or change the equation for people. So if it costs you more to do the other things, you might choose public transport or an alternate move. But in general, humans base their decision-making around transport on convenience. And so this is all about incentivizing, but I guess also disincentivizing, because you can carrot or stick this through pricing, people to use transport options, but you need options for those tools to be used effectively. So we're on all of that. And you can see it's a very complicated and sophisticated suite of things we are considering and implementing at the moment. This government has had a very big focus at this stage on equity. So a lot of what's being invested in is to try and deal with the inevitable inequity that's created by a climate transition. And if you just think about the EV discount and who is most getting that discount, it is a subset of actually what happens if you invest in climate on scale. It tends to benefit those that have and disadvantage those that haven't, and climate change is doing the same thing. So Northland, east coast of New Zealand, the most deprived parts of our country, climate change is having the most significant impact on those communities. They're most likely to have the old emitting cars, and they're most likely, if we put in some form of pricing of carbon, to pay the most in a pricing structure that's applied to everyone equally. So there is a really big focus in New Zealand at this time on ensuring equity and dealing with how we manage that through this transition. Long answer, sorry.
Really good answer. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think that's it. Puts quite a few things in perspective. I know it's transport heavy, but it does. And there is stuff happening in that space. Richard, there's a lot being mentioned about policy, and a lot of the action that we need at the moment in time is in that space. How is Engineering New Zealand possibly positioned to play a role bridging the gap between industry and government?
So one of the key activities Engineering New Zealand does is provide a connection between the best engineering advice and policymakers and government. So we have a team called our Sector Programs team who work with government departments such as Waka Kotahi, such as MB, such as EQC, and where they want engineering advice for the development of policies or regulations or guidance on white papers they've got to put together, and they want that engineering advice from a broad range of organisations rather than from one specific organisation. That's where we help. So we will reach out through our networks, through our technical groups, through our special interest groups, to find the best people to provide that advice, bring them together, help manage the project, and provide that as a package to the government department. Now, we have a particular rule around that, is that we never respond to a tender for work, because if the work can be procured commercially, it should be. But this is the case where you might need 7 different experts, each one from a different 5 from different companies and 2 from universities. So that's how we pull it together. It's incredibly powerful because it directly informs policy. So, for example, it's outside of climate change, but recently we have had a team working together with MB around earthquake-prone buildings and about seismic resilience and response. And so they are working to assess the impact of the new National Seismic Hazard Model. And so you've got a whole bunch of engineering experts providing that advice to government. So that's our most effective way of connecting government and industry.
And it's sheer interesting way too. And I think that there's a lot of awesome work going behind the scenes, and hopefully this will soon bloom into this action that we really need and really quickly need. I think that's a thing that we all struggling with at the moment. Tracey, this is where I think you have a bit of a perspective around this global consultancy perspective and from these institutions that you form part of. How do we get this, all these groups and all these communities and committees to influence policy and get the change that we need?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting. Listen to my fellow panelists, and some great points which we made. That we know that fundamentally the scale of change is absolutely huge, right? And the reality, the complexity of what we're dealing with is a global issue. It's not just an Aotearoa issue or Australian. Fundamentally is global. And look, if I kind of think about FIDIC, FIDIC has a influence and reach across 12 million engineers, and so that probably made us think, if we kind of step back probably 18 months ago, from a Sustainable Development Committee at kind of FIDIC, to kind of think about that and think about how could we influence at a global level, and that sort of collaboration not only needed within FIDIC, but kind of influence across some of the other strategic partners that we ultimately have, particularly in the built environment and infrastructure sort of space. So hence the sort of the thinking and the concept around the climate charter, which FIDIC launched last year, and the purpose really of that was probably more a call of action to the construction and engineering community, really to kind of step up and recognise the sort of need of what we probably collectively need to do to truly be able to be part of the solution to kind of achieve net zero by 2025. And fundamentally, the purpose probably around that was really to align a sort of common ambition and commitment of that sort of community to how do we kind of mitigate climate change, and how do we put consulting and engineering at the forefront of our sort of thinking in terms of innovation and both technical and behavior solutions, but also how do we kind of leverage and share across both in the developed world, but also in some of those developing economies as well, and how does that kind of play out in that sort of way. So it's interesting, even what Richard was talking about before of Engineering New Zealand. I could talk about construction sector coal, and sure, that even Nicole, what kind of doing around certain things is that how do we align, right? We all are driven for a common sense of purpose of what we're trying to do, and collectively on that. So how do we be able to kind of scale up and think systematically wide across this, and all parts of the ecosystem be able to kind of come together across the supply chain and be able to kind of collaborate, share that innovation and test things around it. And it's interesting, I had a conversation with someone the other day, and we're kind of saying, quoting some things like, yes, funding and finance to decarbonize, but we fundamentally will find the money in some shape or form. The innovation, some of it's coming, some of the innovation will actually get, in terms of that, the technology sort of there, but also that human resources and human capacity in terms of the engineering world is going to be vital in relation to be able to provide that support needed around that. So again, this is probably that collectiveness of how we influence and work quite closely with governments are where we're sort of based, but also it's part of that sort of shared collective responsibility that we all need to do that. And then how do we support some of those sort of policies, decisions of making that, because they've no question around EV, what we're going to do, we're going to need massive policies intertwined to be able to allow that together, right? In New Zealand, we know decarbonising transport is not going to happen unless our energy policy, with our sort of technology, digital strategies, and all of that fundamentally are talking to one another, and the sequences and everything like that comes into play. Someone told me this morning about Ireland, talking about data centres and the amount of energy required, in regards to kind of data centres. And in Ireland, seemingly one of the issues is that they kind of run out of water and things around it, right? And that's causing a lot of sort of issues around some of those sort of things. So again, how do we think around the sort of supply chain and everything around it is going to be really, really important collectively to enable that to kind of happen.
Ultimately bringing back the whole conversation to that shared responsibility, making sure everybody is joined in the sole purpose. And I think that one of the questions that I think it's a bit off topic of the thing that I have shared, and I'm going to open up to everybody, is policy. And we hear always a lot of this high level things, but the practical implementation of these things, how do we do that? Anybody care to answer that? The how?
How we do. Look, there was something that Nicole, I nearly asked you a question, because something that you kind of said that made me think that, fundamentally, there's going to be a shift. It's not only, we can kind of decarbonize and work that way, but it is a fundamental shift in the way we live, and probably a shift of where we do business and things like that. And we've probably talked about this, and it requires a big change of visionary leaders, leadership to be able to kind of do that and kind of think ahead. And maybe Richard, Nicole, and maybe Evangelos, what you're seeing around the world, there is that kind of shift that's required of leaders to be able to kind of think longer term, think very visually around that, and how do they kind of are we seeing enough of that, and those type of conversations kind of coming together that really is going to allow that to kind of happen. Because I think, Nicole, that was that, equability that we're seeing here and things like that. And if we're kind of reading all the headlines that come in papers, the tension which is starting to exist, and we've certainly seen that play out in New Zealand at the moment, there is a big role that leaders are going to have to play in this.
Yeah. And look, I think there's I'll give you an example of, they're certainly thinking about this. So in the New Zealand context, this might be useful for people to understand. At the highest level, one way this comes together for infrastructure is that it's through the RMA. They want to create a spatial plan that brings all of the infrastructure together. But like in Australia, probably in a lot of Europe, they sort of do a city or precinct spatial plan, and it'll show what's going to happen in 30, 40, 50 years, what infrastructure is going to be built or maintained. That's the idea. Sounds great in theory, doesn't it? And they want to do that under the new legislation, as well as an adaptation legislation. So there'll be an adaptation plan that comes in and says what's going to happen to that city and that region over time, and how do we need to adapt the plan to deal with these future climate. No, so that's the theory of it, right? So, and then as you scroll that down, then practically underneath that, we're starting to do things like 20 or 30 year plans, as other Aotearoa and everybody else is moving up to that sort of level of planning. And we should theoretically, as it all comes together, push those things together. The reality, though, right now is that Aotearoa is being told to build houses as fast as they can, wherever they can. And the only place they can get land at the prices that they need, and particularly in rural New Zealand, is on the edges of town, so they're growing out. Whilst we are determined that actually we should probably be growing up and in. So the practical reality of trying to deal with this issue in our planning framework at the moment is we're actually wholeheartedly agreeing we need to join up, but we haven't joined up at a planning and spatial planning level. And in the reality of the today, we've got drivers that are driving us in exactly the opposite direction. That's one example of trying to practically implement something that has been talked about in theory, but in practical reality, the incentives are not right in the day-to-day. Another example might be of the difference between theory and practice is this question that someone's put in, which everybody raises: why are you not giving an incentive to electric bikes rather than, the electric vehicles? Well, there's a couple of answers to that. One is we've got a big problem with vehicles. They're the biggest emitters, and actually we need to create a supply chain for vehicles for those 12-year-old vehicles. So we want to bring in those vehicles through wealthier people, through rental companies, and then the supply chain will be created because we don't think there'll be a supply chain in New Zealand. But the bigger issue, actually, because the minister was very big on wanting to do this across all vehicles, including farm vehicles and EVs. One is cost. If you put the money there, you can't put it elsewhere. But two, is actually how do you administer that? These vehicles are not registered. There is no mechanism for us to know who's got them. Once you're giving $1,000 or $2,000 to someone, how do you manage or navigate that? And there's big money at stake when you put that into millions and millions of people's hands. So the reality of, hey, let's just do that for everything. Someone's got to actually administer it. It's public money, and it's actually impossible to do that. And by the way, you'll be again benefiting those people that can afford those things, and they tend to be middle and wealthy in New Zealand, who are the ones that can most afford to pay for these things, whilst at the same time you're taking money away from potentially investing in areas for poorer New Zealanders who can't afford it. So in practical reality, some of these things sound very simple and you should just do that. But the practicality of using, and we have less money than a lot of other parts of the world we compare ourselves to in terms of the amount of money we have to invest. Much more difficult geography, much more spread out, less people, less intensification, and then seismic risk, geological risk. We're a very young country. And so it costs us a lot more to do some of these things from an engineering and implementation perspective. And so we sort of sit in the middle of the theory or the ideology, if you like, or the policy actually, and the reality of trying to implement it and try to give sensible practical advice on that. And we're not only trying to balance can this thing be implemented? But we're also trying to balance, how do we do it equitably, safely, make sure we don't disadvantage other groups in doing it. So that's that complexity, and that's why no organisation can do it by itself. Because actually, first of all, at that highest level, spatial plans will involve everybody that's planning, and all infrastructure organisations will need to be involved in that if we're going to do it well and sensibly. But then even at a practical implementation level, how on earth can a bunch of engineers or professional people in Wellington genuinely create a solution for low-income New Zealanders on the edge of the east coast of New Zealand? You know, we tip up there to talk about electric vehicle leasing scheme, and they don't even have electricity. So, you know, like, so this has to be done. It is a massive change. It requires multiple voices at the table, and some of those voices, our current system doesn't give a loud voice to. In fact, they are quite quiet in our democratic processes, and quite silent, and particularly those from the lowest income or people that are looking after others, or those with disabilities, those types of people. So I think it's a very complex challenge that we're dealing with, and it's just an example of you know, ambition to reality and the complexity of trying to navigate that.
Really good examples, and I think that puts quite a few things in perspective, and always bring up the same questions that you, I'm sure, hear to death about the e-vehicles. And I think that puts a lot of people don't necessarily get that inequality that's being created, and I think that it's an easy solve. So I don't want to be in your shoes, Nicole, but thank you for doing the hard work for us. Then I think one of the questions, I'm going to move over to the questions that's come through. So there's been a couple. One thing that's quite interesting, a bit a lot of question. What do you think is the most important aspect of climate change students need to learn about? What can they do that is what can they do that is in their circle of influence? Quick answer.
So I'm having to field this one. I think the most important thing is, I think students are far more engaged about this than many other people in the community, because they've typically got a much longer future than, say, people of my age. I think the thing I would say, the most important thing, is to be positive. Don't sort of give in to, you know, the climate change fear. Think about the solutions, but particularly think about, who do you want to be the leaders? Who do you want to be the leaders of the future? Because this problem is going to be solved by leaders in society changing the way our society works. So it's thinking about, who do you want to be the leaders? Do you want to be one of the leaders? What do you need to do to start getting those conversations happening? As Nicole says, we've got to align the incentives, and if we align the incentives, then things will start changing. But it's a societal change. It's more than just an individual change. Even if you do all your stuff individually, it's not going to change. You know, it's going to require all of society to do it. And I think the key is thinking positively about what can be done, rather than negatively about what might happen.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because, you know, I am talking to a bunch of engineers, so you can send me texts if I'm rude to you here, but I think it's quite important, actually, as a young engineer or person that wants to make a difference in the world, and I think a lot of young engineers, actually, that's exactly why they go into engineering, to understand there's a hard education, which might be how I decarbonise a project, or how I'm thinking about climate in a design sense, or that type of thing. And then there's a soft side, which is, how do I lead and influence? How do I not have a fixed mindset about right and wrong? How do I be a good collaborator and a communicator on things that the average Joe Blogs may not understand and can't comprehend very well? And from my experience with engineers who are very ambitious and want to go a long way, they do very well on the engineering aspects, and often get to a point where it's the other aspects that limit their ability to grow and expand their influence and impact. So I would work on yourself, who you are, what your preferences are and how you change how you develop yourself as a person and leader to be able to influence, to be able to see different perspectives, to be able to work with others, to be able to present information clearly and simply, as much as you work on the technical aspects of being a great engineer, because those skills are the ones that are the game changers for the future, and the types of skills that that will be sitting at that top table making aligning parties as opposed to polarizing parties, which will only just make us sit in our corners and get angrier and angrier.
Yeah, well, can I just echo what Nicole said there? Because I think, what we're probably seeing, I think a lot of the young engineers coming in are very passionate, right? Very purposeful. And as we know, it's not, to Nicole's point, it's not just the hard engineering, in terms of the problem, the complex problem solving, but the reality is there are big society issues, there are human issues, there's people, we serve communities, right, in relation to that. And a lot of it now is to focus around the broader outcome, but some things is how do they kind of continue to kind of hold us to account, right? And living their values and thinking very different, and they think very long term, they think very future term, they think very intergenerational, and those ideas and all of that to keep them coming through are really, really important, as well as the eminence and things, but innovation and some of those other sort of AI and all like that, they're all part of it as well. But I think Nicole's point, last week I was at a conference that said now the kind of top 5 skills that you need are kind of leading by the heart, and that's kind of thing, hard to say that to an engineer, that you need to now think about empathy and compassion and care and development and things like that. But it's now that, so it is a lot of that softer sort of skills and things like that, which are quite important, to think more broadly of the outcomes we're trying to do, and the community's trying to serve around this as well. Of course, you have the eminence kind of coming through and that developing as well.
Yeah, Evangelos.
If I may add on to what everybody else said, I couldn't agree more with the points that were raised. I think just to start off with Richard's point, we are seeing now that climate anxiety is a big thing, especially on the younger generations. So there's a lot of conversation between teenagers, people born after the 2000s, on why is this happening? What can we do about this? This sounds like a very stressful and dangerous situation to be in. So being able and teaching students how to deal with this is very important, both in terms of their development as professionals, as well as when it comes to tackling the problem itself. So I think that's a very important point. From my perspective, when it comes to what students should know, I think it's very important to explain to younger engineers why there is a different conversation about adaptation, a different conversation about mitigation, and a different conversation about resilience. I think being able to segment the problem into these 3 key pillars is very critical in actually dealing with it and the consequences of climate change. So this, together with the scientific basis of climate change and how do we know it's happening, is very important to transmit to younger people, especially because, as I'm sure you've noticed in the past few years, there's a bit of a conversation about information and its validity and fake news and so on and so forth. But we need to be able to teach younger students, younger engineers, younger people in general, to follow the scientific process, to prove that what we know is true, and kind of be able to deal with misinformation or disinformation, especially around the climate change. So I think I'll leave it at that.
I think it's so exhilarating to know that our current leaders are telling our future leaders to be them full self and bring that drive to work, to make the change, but also be compassionate in the work that we do. I think that's a really powerful message to for this session, a sort of a closing moment. I'm going to do the impossible and ask our panelists to summarize our closing question in 1 or max 2 sentences. Try really hard. I know it's always difficult. The closing question is, what's your biggest vision, your role in the fight for climate action? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. The key for me is that all engineers at all age groups focus on solutions, not relitigating the problems.
Great, Richard. Love that.
I'm happy to go. I would say maybe we need to stop calling it a fight. As in a world post-COVID that is polarized and that creates conflict. I'm not sure that's the right way to position what we're doing here. Most New Zealanders want climate action and most are willing to make some changes to get there. They do want this. It is in their hearts. So I've come up with this word stagility, which is how do we move fast while making people feel safe and dealing with inequities.
I love that. That needs to be a Waka Kotahi slogan somewhere on the TV.
We might just
Tracey.
put a pothole at the end just to make sure people
Just make sure you get that engagement.
Yeah.
Tracey.
Look, I wonder, I'm probably making this up at the top of my head now, but you know, Nicole, I love what you kind of say there, because I think we have to stop calling it a fight, right? You know, it is, you know, we should, I think Richard, you said that positivity, right? We need to believe in ourselves. We need to believe in society and all like that we will, you know, we will get on top of this and address this. And to the point, I actually think that collaboration is sort of strength around it. And how do we utilize the knowledge and capability and the research and development in that entire ecosystem is going to be really, really important. And we just need to start sharing our learning, sharing our IP, sharing the data, and being able to look outwards, you know, around what that, and stop reinventing that. We need to think we always need to reinvent, you know, something from the start to be able to learn and then apply that and bring that in here. I think it's going to be key.
Really, that's a very, very important point, and hopefully we can see that cross-industry connection and collaboration soon. Evangelos, your closing statement?
Yeah, a lot of the work that we do with the WFEO Young Engineers Future Leaders is around youth inclusion. So I just hope to continue seeing more of the youth, you know, stepping up, taking responsibility, taking authority, saying their opinions out loud and proudly. And yeah, I'm sure this is gonna work out to the best. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate everybody's thoughts for today and the exciting about just the absolute knowledge that was shared across the industry in this panel was really powerful, and so much that I've learned. And I think everybody online could just take that with them. Some of those key messages of collaboration, massive action that we need, sharing, getting youth involved, youth being yourself in this process. I'm really excited for to see how we go forward and taking all these learnings. I'm going to close off our session with a karakia whakamutanga. Kia whakaerea te tapu, kia watia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.